My name's Sumitra Upham and I'm a senior curator at the Design Museum in London. This talk is part of a series of creative conversations that the Design Museum has organised for the summit, exploring how design can equip us with tools for building a more sustainable future. I'm thrilled today to be joined by two esteemed guests, Opara and Huda Smitshausen AbiFares, for a talk exploring the role of graphic design and typography in shaping identities for the future. As other panels over the last couple of days have acknowledged, the tumultuous last 12 months have been a period of great awakening as we become ever more aware of the vulnerabilities that exist in our economies, in our supply chains, but also in our relationships with each other and with our natural world. And as we begin to strategize for change, it's important that we assess the tools that are available to us in building a new world. And graphic design is a critical tool that arguably will play a fundamental role in helping us move forward together and in helping us to reimagine a future, both now and in years to come. But despite its ubiquity, graphic design's connection with the wider world and the value that it brings is something that I think is often misunderstood. My two guests today have a lot to say about this, and without further ado, I'd like to introduce you to them. Firstly, we have Huda Smitshausen AbiFares, a graphic designer, educator, writer, curator, publisher, many different titles. She specializes in multilingual typographic research and design with a focus on Arabic typography and design history. Huda is the founding director of the Cat Foundation and Cat Books Publishers. She's based in Amsterdam, but her work extends throughout Europe and the US and all the way to the Arab world. Huda, welcome. We also have Opara joining us. Eddie is a designer born in London and now lives in New York and has done for over 25 years or something like that. He established his own studio, the Map Office, in 2005 and joined the global design agency Pentagram in 2010, where he has worked on multiple projects, including exhibitions, books, brand identities and digital projects for some very impressive clients, including the likes of Samsung and SF MoMA. So Huda and Eddie, welcome. While you both operate in very different contexts, professionally and of course geographically, what brings your work together, if I can, perhaps is your positioning of graphic design as a catalyst for social change. So by way of introducing your work, but also yourselves, tell us a bit about what brought you to graphic design and what are some of the kind of guiding principles that define your work. Eddie, can I go to you? I think you're on mute.
It's a pleasure to be here today. What brought me to graphic design was this pursuit to communicate, an urgency to communicate. Initially, I was thinking of moving into architecture as a young lad back in London, and I started to think about the idea of how to communicate a lot less in a spatial manner and more in a sort of direct, you could say linguistic manner, but more textual. And understanding the sort of power of that and the ability to sort of to do that. You know, I was always sort of intrigued by graphic design and why it wasn't seen as you could say an important profession when I was sort of growing up as a kid. But I feel that right now that I am a graphic designer, I think it's one of the most sort of powerful design practices, professions that you can actually have within the design world. And you know, it's the sort of underpinning of how we really interact and communicate and create dialogue. And that's exceptionally important.
Huda.
That sounds very interesting, that probably every graphic designer always starts by thinking they want to become an architect, and then something happens that changes their mind. Because I had also the same thing, but I think it's also because at least I grew up in Beirut and the graphic design was not a field that was known. So it was the closest you can come to design is either fashion or architecture. And yeah, as a kid, I always wanted to make things. So for me, it was like I think, a natural designer. I liked to make things and draw. And when I discovered graphic design, I felt it was just the right thing for me. But later on, I think once I started really studying and working as a graphic designer, then I think the importance of what I did became something more than just an individual thing. I discovered that you can, that it is a very powerful tool to communicate, to bring change, to do meaningful work. And it wasn't just about self-expression. And that to me was, yeah, I only get more and more passionate about it as I do it, in a way.
I mean, building on that, you both seem to share a kind of curiosity for using design as a means to explore and to shape cultural identities. But of course, you know, identity, as we all know, is a very kind of politically loaded term and a complex term. But when we talk about identity within the context of graphic design, generally conversations tend to be centered around brands and, you know, building brand identities. But I think, as both of your work demonstrates, letter forms are loaded cultural objects that tell stories about the people who design them and the stories they want to tell. And I think we all agree there is a much greater potential for graphic design to channel the ideas of people and to help form or shape cultural identities. So I'm interested in hearing your thoughts on this, and how have you used graphic design to carry cultural narratives that are close to you? Huda, do you want to take this one first?
Yeah, I mean, I think typography and scripts in general, writing systems, are really loaded cultural material because they represent cultures, they represent the visualizing of thought, the visualizing of differences. And I think in recent years, it's only become more and more important as a tool to kind of bring back forgotten scripts or less representative cultures, and sometimes the identification to these cultures are often more emotional. So the attachment to a script is not just for it to be a practical thing, but it also represents a culture on a very basic level. So typography in a way is like the building block of communication and visual communication. You can't do without it, but whatever you do, even though it is ubiquitous and everywhere around us, and we use it and we take it for granted, it also has a very subconscious meaning. So even in the visual representation, so when we look at the Arabic script, for example, it's very, it's not the only script that is loaded with meaning to the culture, but it is very emblematic of Islamic and Arab culture. And so when you see the script as a person belonging to this community, or even an outsider, you already know you are in that context. And that makes the script special, but also if you get to know it better, there's also very many subtleties and history behind it that tells also a story about the connection between cultures, the connection between the script and the transformation of culture over the centuries. And then it's very important to think about, it becomes for today a very important means to think about, okay, how do we represent this culture in the future? What do we do with this writing system? What do we create in terms of fonts or typefaces or new calligraphic styles? How far can we go and how far can we not go? And often, with my experience from the projects we've done at the Heart Foundation, because we really decided to focus on that because we felt that I felt that this was a very important element in Arab design. That's what makes the Arabic design Arabic, is the script, nothing else. Everything else is contemporary. So what do we do with the 21st century? How do we present Arab cultural identity in the 21st century? Should it be, and it's also very, you don't want to make something that works everywhere because Arab culture is also very dynamic and very different. There are regions, there are histories that are different, there are common things and things that are particular to certain countries or certain regions. And how do we talk about that? And, it always brings very emotional discussions and very politically motivated discussions. So it plays, a little bit beyond the practical things. It becomes also a statement. And sometimes it's just a practical thing, a practical design. It could be also just that. but the two kind of work together.
Eddie, do you want to build on that?
Yeah, you know, in regards to what Huda said, the building typography being the building blocks of communication is absolutely correct. You know, when looking at the aspect of self and the aspects of identity, I harp back to my thesis at Yale on the idea of multiplicity of self in a digital age, and how to construct that sense of self. And that's what, there was a sense of awareness that Yale at the time was allowing us to become our own authors or auteur, instead of being sort of seen as creating so many sort of commercial brand elements, even though that we do that. And it's because we wanted to make sure that we project our thoughts and in an empowering manner. If one understands oneself as a designer or an auteur, one actually can really express themselves immensely for other persons as well. You can actually really pull out a lot of conceptual and exploratory and strategic elements from that. And I think that's a really important factor that graphic designers actually have, this ability to really pull the sense of one's identity out and project it for many, from 1 to a billion people successfully. And it's a very impressive thing that we actually do that really doesn't get talked about enough. And, sort of going back to the aspects of self, I also was working very early on in regards to understanding the power of writing, on authors such as Baldwin and other African-American authors like Ellison, and these authors have so many empowering, emotional texts that are interconnected to being somebody who is Black British, but also Black in America. And how does one then start to learn from that and project a more empowering manner of relaying information for the Black public, whether it be on a cultural level or from a political or economic level for different types of clients. And I think that has been successful and is a growing area that we need to really hone in on. The idea of being a global identity maker is good, that's fantastic, but we have to really look at the grassroots, look at things on the level of the smaller communities to make them more empowered. They need designers like us to develop and sculpt and design and project their voices. That's an imperative element. Yeah, their selves, that is.
Yeah, and I think that's been it's fascinating hearing you talk. And I mean, I know that this idea of kind of localism and the importance of localism has been a theme that's been running over the last couple of days of the conference. And, you know, as a concept or as a kind of political issue is something that's definitely been born out of the last, it's been heightened over the last 12 months. Bill, expanding on what you were just talking about, Eddie, I mean, this last year has been a kind of stark reminder of how deeply enmeshed our lives are with those of others. But in this period of social separation, I think graphic design has demonstrated, exactly as you say, that it can help kind of bring people together across the globe and help to kind of mediate cross-cultural exchange and dialogue. We saw it in the powerful, inventive solidarity responses to the Black Lives Matter protests last summer. Equally, we saw it in the kind of supportive campaigns and response around the Beirut explosion last year as well. in these cases, graphic design has acted as a means to instigate cross-cultural awareness and support. And so I guess my question to both of you is, what is distinct about graphic design as a medium that can help mediate cross-cultural exchange and dialogue? And Huda, I know this is something you've thought a lot about in your work. Maybe you could take it first.
Yeah, I mean, I think with designers in general, we are trained to collaborate because the nature of the work we do is always about working with others. And we can never produce something alone. It's not like you can sit in your studio and make it. You have to collaborate. So in a way, we are always forced to explain what we do to somebody else to be able to produce something. So we're trained to be communicating as best as we can, and we're trained to collaborate. So for designers, it's often easy to collaborate in that sense and the process, but there's always, of course, your personality, your ideas, and you know, giving room for other people to pinch in or to bring something of their own, and to be really good at listening. And that's, of course, always a struggle. And I think that with my experience, it's always a nice challenge. It's always a challenge for a designer to be put in a team where you are collaborating with people from a different discipline that you're kind of a little bit used to, or certain disciplines that you're collaborating with, you're used to that. But you're also facing something more complicated, which is maybe somebody who's doing similar discipline, but in another culture, in another language, another mentality, and another rhythm and pace. They work differently. Their level of communicating, you know, human politeness is different. So on these things, it's really a very nice challenge to be put in that position and to know that you have to enter the project with one thing, like a few principles in mind: to be open-minded, to feel fair, that it's fair, you're being fair, you know, you're giving enough room for other people. You respect their point of view, even if you don't always understand it or agree with it. And then work together to kind of find common ground, to make something happen, to produce something together. And this kind of negotiation, I think, is really very important in this exchange between cultures. I mean, my experience as a human being, I've traveled and lived in different cultures, and every time I come with a prejudice, because that's just normal. You know, I come and say, I don't like the British. And then I meet British people that I like, you know, just because I'm telling you you're British, that's why I say it. So it's just an example, but it's more like you go somewhere foreign and your reaction as a human being is, you know, you have to defend yourself. It's threatening a little bit. This challenge is threatening. But there's also this moment where you say, okay, I take the challenge and I try to be open. I try to say, no, it's not threatening. And I try to discover the good things. And I think as a design process, that's really important, because that's the moment where you discover and you grow and you expand your knowledge. And you start to see that, you know, we want to preserve differences, but there's also enough in common that you don't have to run away when things are a little bit different than what you expect. And that you have to kind of face your biggest fears. Like if I feel that I'm in a place that I don't like, or a project I'm very uncomfortable with and I can't sleep at night, I know it's a good project, because I know that it's going to make me be the best I can be and make me go further. And with communication between cultures, I think we need to do that. I mean, I think that, for example, for me, what happened with the collaboration in this COVID-19 crisis between the different scientists that were working on vaccines, when they put aside the idea of they have to compete and make the biggest money, and they were working for a bigger goal than themselves, it succeeded in a very good way, in a very fast way. So that's something that's a really hopeful lesson, I think. And it's something that I think designers should also sometimes, you know, I think that we could still we could still produce work that is commercial, that is profitable, but it shouldn't be the only or the priority in the equation. It should be what comes anyway, naturally later.
You know, to sort of add to what Huda has stated, you know, the aspects of design equity is exceptionally important, and within graphic design, it can get the sense of equity is loaded in a very affirmed manner, loaded with so many different types and diverse amount of people that you really have to cater for. And I think it's actually one of the the only design areas that really does that. And you know, if you really think about user experience, that's also interconnected with graphic designers as well. And so there's a large important factor about really getting the different nuances of the different languages and the different cultures, the different attitudes correct. And as we sort of move further into the 21st century, we need different capabilities to enable us to do this work correctly, maybe by using, maybe by really focusing our attention a lot better on artificial intelligence in a non-biased manner, may actually help us really communicate, make it a better communicating system for us to use, a framework to use. I think the aspects of collaboration is exceptionally important as well, but you know, I think it's definitely a sort of set term for all designers. But the argument really here is sort of really sort of going back in again and looking at the aspects of oneself, right? Asking those questions, really delving into the particular person's mindset, the people's mindsets, because it's a mixture of so many different attitudes. We do not build things that are, you know, even considered to be overtly static. It doesn't stay in one place. It's always moving. It's always, you know, it's always fleeting. You're always moving past it. You're always reading through it. You know, up, down, through, whatever it is with graphic design, you have to sort of, you know, deal with those particular aspects and limitations. So I think it's exceptionally important, and you know, work that we've been working on for reincorporated with Megan Rapinoe, Kristen Press, and Tobin Heath, the US World Cup soccer team players, has been really important in regards to understanding the sense of equity and diversity on so many different levels, and the diversity in regards to the amount of things that you have to communicate is exceptionally impressive. Every single drop, every 3 months, you're developing a new theme, a new structure to really encapsulate the diversity that they're trying to communicate towards.
Yeah. I would like to add one thing on this. I think it's also important that to look at, you know, the more the global we become, the more we have to communicate across cultures. And sometimes for the bigger brands, it's a very big challenge to create a system where, you know, what is readable in one culture may not be readable in another. What is aesthetically acceptable may not be acceptable. And how do you communicate a brand across these cultural landscape? And often with typography, I mean, this trend of making these big families, like, you know, universal families in a way, because they contain all these different scripts that come in very different constructions and have very different conventions and have very different sensitivities. And yet at the same time, you want to pretend that it comes from one company. So it's these kind of like real incredible challenges that are also exciting, I think. And you see that a lot of designers respond to this in very different approaches. And it brings, like, again, a discussion of what is important cultural heritage to retain. And recently I heard from one of the pioneers of graphic design in the Arab world, Kamil Hawa, who said, you know, we don't have to worry so much about our heritage because it's in our DNA. We just have to act and design authentically and, you know, honestly, and do what we think is right, because the heritage is already there. Like, you don't have to go back and look at history. It's part of you. You are the heritage. And I thought that was a brilliant, you know, expression of yes, we have to be aware of it, but we also have to be aware that we are also alive and we are part of that heritage.
And the aspect of progressing as well in a very sort of fluid manner. You know, once you've finished something, you have to sort of pick it up again and move on. So the idea of really like solving that problem really isn't the right sort of term. You know, I use Milton Glazer's, who just passed away, a sort of term that he had is like, graphic design is that you go from one condition to a better one, and then again and again and again. And so that's, you're always progressing, you're always trying to make it better. And that's what's really exciting. It's never, you can never sort of put it down and say, okay, this is fully complete. There's not, it doesn't make any sense anymore, not in this 21st century world.
We have 5 minutes left, so I could talk to both of you for hours. I think just building on this idea of equity and access and equality. Yesterday there was a talk with the British architect Asif Khan, who was in conversation with Tatiana Bilbao, and he said something that has stuck with me, and I'm paraphrasing massively, but it was something along the lines of, in order to have great cities, we need diversity, not only in the people who live in them, but also in the people who design them. And I thought this was an interesting point to pick up and perhaps close with both of you, and to ask your thoughts on this, because as we know, graphic design is one of those agents that contributes to our understanding of the built environment, and also towards our sense of belonging within it. And it kind of picks up on some of what Huda was saying about the impact of graphic design. So my question really is, what role does graphic design play in creating in building cities and creating communities, and above all in providing access? Maybe you could each share a couple of thoughts to that rather large question.
Huda, do you want to go first?
I was hoping you would do. Well, I mean, I think, yeah, that's a tough question. I mean, I think that we do have a role because in a way, everything that you communicate through in the city, whether it's digital, whether it's in the built environment, is already designed by graphic designer of sort. So I think it's just really, my feeling is that young designers now, they are a bit more aware of that fact, that they don't see themselves as just making one project. They see that their project has really bigger ramifications. And we do have a responsibility to make things accessible and to kind of also give places or cities a kind of human face, that people feel attached to it, that it's not just putting information out there, but it's nice to go to a park and find poetry. It's nice to engage in a different level with people, that they actually feel part of that, the cities they live in, because a lot of times cities don't have, they're kind of disjointed, and you don't have a sense. Maybe London is different because it feels like little villages, but New York, for example, is different. And so I think sometimes you have to give, the place has to talk to you, that you feel, part of it. And I think in a way it's good for the cities, because then you feel you're responsible towards the city, responsible towards your neighbor. You have a kind of sense of shared environment. And that shared environment should have a little bit more of a human touch. And you see it sometimes. I just want to say one thing that I see happening in design, especially in the Arab world, there's a kind of return to like the handmade things. And that's again a language of, of the craft, and the handmade gives that human sense and human communication beyond just, pure sensible information.
Yeah. When I was a kid, I was really fascinated. I didn't do it myself. I'm not going to sort of about graffiti in New York City, and how this raw, city-based art form and design form and a way to communicate became exceptionally fluid, where you would spray it onto a train and that train would run all the way through the city. I mean, total geniuses in regards to showing who they are, and the aspects of respect. I don't believe that should really die out. I feel as though it should try to evolve itself more so within a certain strata of the city, of cities that need to have it. It shouldn't really be the idea that you have different regions that do different things. I think they should all sort of merge together as one or flow into one another. And graphic design can actually sort of do that. And I think it's imperative. But the one sort of foundational element that needs to come, and all this needs to come through, is policy. And how do we stress the importance of design, from service design to strategic design to graphic design, information design, user interface and UX design elements that policymakers need to understand, to need to make it clearer for them, because they are they're elected officials that are representing you, and they need to be the ones that really understand how design really works, not just the aspects of architecture and building a monument, but the idea of how the system can actually interact and, you know, be invested in, more importantly. And as Huda has basically stated, to really look up to and be really, really proud of, you know, their sense of identity, and showing that identity to other cities, other towns, other villages around the world, and seeing how they can actually, be successful with that. You know, graphic design is and has a sense of being invisible. I like that.
It's also part of its power in a way. Like,
yeah, I couldn't agree more. But there is so much to graphic design that is not visible, and I think interesting conversations like this really demonstrate that. I'm afraid we're going to have to leave it there because we're bang on past. I could talk to both of you for ages. I hope we have some architects and urbanists listening, because I think architecture could learn a lot from graphic design. Huda, Eddie, thank you for such thoughtful and generous responses, and I hope we can pick up the conversation again soon.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you very much.